Hello, everybody. Welcome on this September Tuesday evening. I'd like to welcome you all to the first FHABC speaker series of the year. About the FHABC, we were formed in 1982, and we encourage the collection, preservation, and use of historical material related to the forests of British Columbia. We publish a newsletter that contains articles, biographies, lists of new literature, book reviews, notices of meetings, and so on. We're also currently running a book club. We're reading HR, a biography of H.R. Macmillan by Trent Druska right now. And we also run this fall speaker series. Generally, we run at this time slot, so on the third Tuesday of every month at 7 o'clock. Your memberships that give us both the financial and spiritual strength to continue this work. So please join us on our website. Memberships are only $20 a year, $50 for 3 years. And by that, you'll receive regular updates from our mailing list for the events like these and others I just mentioned, as well as a first look at our newsletter. We're also always looking for new energy, new projects, new pairs of hands to continue doing the work we do. So please come join us if you're interested. I'd like to introduce Larry Pedersen. Larry Pedersen was Chief Forester of British Columbia from 1994 to 2004. He was a graduate from UBC with a Bachelor of Science in Forestry in 1975. And I heard recently he was spending some time with his old classmates at an old reunion. So particularly any of you folks, if you're there and you're interested in giving a talk like Larry's or just discussing to us and having a conversation with us about your career and things you have to say about that, please reach out. During Larry's career, he advanced through a number of positions in the Forest Service and worked as well in the private sector. As Chief Forester, he was responsible for developing plans and programs to manage the provincial forest and rangelands. He is also responsible for determining timber harvest levels for each timber supply area and tree farm license in the province, the AAC, if you've heard and not familiar with that. He oversaw the development of Forest Practices Code of British Columbia Act, as well as subsequent Forest and Range Practices Act. He is a recipient of the Distinguished Forest Professionals Award in 2005 and is a lifetime member retired of the Professional Foresters Association. So with that, I'd like to welcome you, Larry, and pass the torch to you.
Okay, thanks, Alan, and greetings, everybody. I see a couple of people like Peter Ackhurst and Peter Marshall who attended a presentation I did last fall for the CIF chapter in Vancouver.
Sorry, I just muted our Larry here. Sorry, Larry. You'll have to unmute yourself. I was busy muting everyone else.
Okay.
Okay. Start again. Apologies.
All right. Yeah, sorry, I'm not sure how I ended up muted there, but so I'm just going to go back here. So greetings, everybody. I just was saying with my microphone off that I see a couple of faces like Peter Marshall and Peter Ackhurst. This presentation is based on a presentation that I made last fall to the CIF in Vancouver. And being a bit lazy and retired, I'm repeating that presentation with a few updates. So Peters, if I didn't put you to sleep then, I'm going to give you my best shot right now. And I've made a couple of changes, so pay attention and see if you can find them. So just to start from the top, this is not something that I do anymore. This was in my deep past, making presentations, being at podiums, pitching the shtick about BC forestry and things that we were working at. So it's a bit challenging for me to come back and try and think about making a presentation that hopefully has some amount of relevance in some areas for some of you that decided to come and see what's being said. So I'm quite willing to take questions during the presentation, but we will definitely do some question and answers after the presentation if there's any interest to do so. I want to honor a bit of the history of the Chief Forester's office. So I'll be reviewing the history of the Forest Service and the Chief Forester's role. Talk a little bit about my background and some things that happened that have me end up in the role. And I want to talk a bit about the Sopron Foresters and their influence in my career. And my advance isn't working. Okay, there we go. I have a few challenges that I faced. I want to tell some stories about things that were said and done during my tenure as chief forester. Some, as shown there, timber supply review, mountain pine beetle, market campaigns, and a bit of a look at coastal old growth forests and their contribution to timber supplies. I have a few thoughts about some of the challenges currently facing forestry in BC, and I have a few questions for consideration. So the history, I mean, you're the Forest History Association. I'm probably not going to tell you anything that you haven't seen or discussed before, but I'm going to do a bit of a chronology going back to the Fulton Royal Commission of 1909, which recommended that a Department of Forests be established for the conservation of forests, that there be a chief forester, there should be field staff, and there should be statisticians and recording experts. Reported into the legislature in 1911, and it led to royal assent for the new Forest Act in 1912. And it had some, as all royal commissions, some very, very detailed recommendations. And this one's kind of fun. It said, with reference to the chief forester, it is essential that the chief forester should be a first-class scientific man, thoroughly well qualified, who has had both technical and practical training and expertise. So much will depend upon the wide knowledge and sound judgment of this official that the province should spare no pains in searching the continent for a man of exceptional ability. So I'm not sure. I have my first question. Should I feel flattered, or were the standards lowered in 1994? I don't know the answer to that. So in honoring the history, inevitably it's important to reflect on BC's first chief forester, H.R. McMillan. He was a true rags to riches story, born on a farm in a Quaker family in southern Ontario. After he finished high school, he got himself to college at the University of Toronto and got a degree in agriculture, and then subsequently moved on to Yale and got a degree as Master of Science in Forestry. So he is a great story. There's been lots written and said about him, not the least of which is, I think, the most comprehensive, and Ellen just referenced it, HR by Ken Druschka. Um, in early years, HR was very successful building the Forest Service. And it's of interest to me, and this showed up as hallmarks throughout his career. He was all about bringing science to the forefront of land management and science to the forefront of technical development and wood products. He was well ahead of his time in promoting conservation and having good empirical evidence for how forests are being managed. He was only in the role, as famous as he is for that, for 3 years from 1912 to 15. And then he formed the H.R. McMillan Export Company. And his partner in that was none other than W.J. Van Dusen of the Van Dusen Gardens. These two gentlemen left quite a legacy in British Columbia from their successful businesses. 1933, he was president of the Vancouver Board of Trade, and then we know he merged his company with Stuart Bloedel in 51 to form McMillan Bloedel. At that time, they were the largest producer of forest products in BC. And when he had trouble moving product offshore, he built a shipping company in order to achieve that objective. A very remarkable businessman. He was appointed as a commander of the Order of the British Empire as well as the Order of Canada. The Order of the British Empire largely had to do with his service in supporting Britain and sending high quality spruce stocks during World War I to help them keep their fleet in the air. And he was well recognized in that country as a significant contributor to both the wars. Um, as I said, he always had science and research as a foundation of his companies. When I started in forestry in BC, it was known that M&B had a research department, that they did, really significant product development work, and they had field-based scientists looking at forestry and continuing to try and evolve forest practices in BC. History does declare him as a renowned philanthropist and BC's greatest forester. He was once considered the wealthiest man in Canada, and in the 60s, his worldwide assets were over $4 billion.
Ooh,
He, do
60s.
he donated 100 million to educational and religious causes. And, everybody thinks of the Blodell Conservancy and the H.R. McMillan Space Center and the McMillan Building at UBC, but the H.R. McMillan Theological Library at the Vancouver School of Theology is one of the foremost major theological libraries in Canada. He was a deeply religious man. Since those early beginnings in 1912, the Forest Service has been housed in 12 different ministries, including the one that I call the Ministry of Alphabet Soup, Forest Lands, Natural Resource Operations, and Rural Development. But more often than not, it's been called the BC Forest Service or the BC Ministry of Forests as it currently is. I double checked these numbers today and updated them. There's been 35 ministers, 27 deputies, 18 chief foresters. I was number 14. And the current incumbent working out of Kamloops is Shane Berg. He's number 18. So forest policy in BC has a history of being driven by some very, very high level process to keep up with changing times, changing values, economics, environmental issues. There were 3 royal commissions, a Forest Resources Commission led by Sandy Peel, and a host of other strategic sectoral reviews. And in May of this year, for example, Minister Parmar announced the formation of the Provincial Forestry Advisory Council. We've always been driven by this lofty process, and I have this tiny, quiet little question. Is it time for something bigger, another big commission? So the chief forester's role evolved from 1912 to today as public values changed, as legislation changed, as the industry grew. The role has largely been seen as providing technical leadership on sustainable forest management, facilitating the integration of sustainable forest management in and outside of the ministry. In my term, I worked as closely with the Ministry of Environment as I did with my staff in the Forest Service and research branch or inventory. That was my resource stewardship division, as it's currently called. For me, it was forestry division. One of the biggest, most intensive, time-consuming roles that I had in my tenure was setting harvest limits, setting the allowable cuts for the province. I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. I worked a lot on gene resource management, which in current times is extremely vital in the world of climate shifts. I looked at the structures that were in place, the Interior and Coast Tree Improvement Councils, and found them, very well intended and working hard, not quite the right structure for the times. So I collapsed those and formed the Forest Genetics Council of BC and initiated the formation of Select Seed Company, just as examples of kind of organizational decisions that were taken to try and create a good, sustainable future for seed management in the province. I worked for 6 different ministers. They're listed on the screen, and 5 different deputies. I worked with NDP administrations and I worked with Liberal administrations. The chief forester's role is considered very independent of government, being defined and mandated in legislation. And I was able to work closely with the NDP caucuses and ministers as I was with the Liberal administrations. I left the role after 10 years, having basically seen the policy cycles come around more than once. So I went to BC Timber Sales when it was being set up to basically establish market signals to address what then was the softwood lumber challenge of the day, which continues on in its current infinite stream. And then in 2005, I was appointed as Deputy Minister of Agriculture and Lands, and I described that as going from the forest fire to the fish frying pan because I was responsible for finfish aquaculture in the province, and it was just about as hot as any fire I've ever attended. My skill set had evolved at that point to having deep knowledge about how government functions and deep knowledge about how large organizations are run. And I considered it a true privilege to finish my last 5 years as a deputy minister. But how did I become chief forester? Well, I often say that it had something to do with a guy by the name of John Zauer, and I'll come back to that point, but I'm going to basically tell a little story within the story. Who was Andras Zelke? So I graduated from high school in Quesnel in 1970. And in our graduation ceremony, this guy, Andras Zelke, was the operations forester for Weldwood of Canada in Quesnel. And Andy walked across the stage and gave me a $500 scholarship check to send me off to UBC. I did not know that I was bound for forestry at that time because you had to do first year science and then 4 years of forestry. So I went with my $500 and off I went to UBC in Vancouver from small town Quesnel that didn't even have sawmill or pulp mills at that point in time. And that $500 was enough to pay my tuition and part of my room and board at Totem Park. Amazing back then how affordable things were. But there's the list. These are all people I worked for during my career. Frank Z was my first boss. Antal Kozak was my thesis advisor. Emery Spandley was my second boss. Joe Namath third. John Zauer I worked for in Williams Lake, and I'll come back to that story about him. And Julius Uhas, a man for whom I had deep respect, executive director of operations division for the Forest Service in Victoria. These were all Sopron foresters, and I can say unequivocally they had a tremendous influence on my career, along with many others. I'm sure most of you have a sense of the Sopron story, but I think it deserves a little reflection. Um, the school was a very old school in Europe. And in 1956, the Hungarian Revolution was underway. Russian troops had invaded, and there was a strong resistance on the ground, including by the students and some of the professors at the Budapest Sopron School of Forestry. But it was quickly realized that approaching Soviet tanks weren't going to be stopped, and their resistance efforts were futile. So amazingly, these numbers, 450 students, 50 professors, and families, fled across the open borders to Austria on November 4th of 1956. And while initially it was hoped that they would be able to return to the country, it became clear that that would not happen. So they put out an appeal around the world for somebody to help them continue their academic studies. Canada and UBC responded, and 14 faculty members and 200 students left for Canada in 1957. And these guys faced a ton of challenges, not the least of which was language and cultural issues. But UBC and the Government of Canada made strong commitments to help the school endure at UBC. And in May 1961, the last class graduated with 141 graduates in total. And 5 years later, by 66, 80% of the graduates remained in Canada, and a remarkably high number carried on and got postgraduate degrees. Antal Kozak, my thesis advisor and stats prof, once reflected that the 100 or so Sopron foresters that worked in BC had a significant and positive influence on forest policy and practices. And I wholeheartedly agree with that. These people came to Canada at a time when the industry was developing and growing, and they brought the history of European forestry. They brought European practices to the forefront in BC. And I learned from each one of the Soprons that I met. I had them as professors. I met them on the ground in the forest sector. Istvan Polnai with Weyerhaeuser toured me in the States to see the Weyerhaeuser forestry model. It was just endless learnings for me as chief forester and earlier in my career, working with all of these very important immigrants to Canada. So why do I say John Zauer set my path towards becoming chief forester? So in '86, I left Drew Sawmills and I moved to in Melliqua, Salmon Arm area. And I moved to Williams Lake and I took the position of a regional planning forester, and I inherited a process of TSA planning, which was to create 5-year plans that had been underway for several years. And it was very clear to me when I landed and got grounded that there was a lot of paralysis by analysis in this process. Things were just constantly being examined and turned over, but no progress was made in moving the data towards a plan and in setting zones for forestry emphasis and conservation zones and mule deer winter ranges. And I worked on them diligently for a couple of years. I did a lot of modeling. I answered a lot of questions. And one day my regional manager, John Sauer, came to me and he said, and I'm not going to mimic his accent, but approximately, Larry, do you think when it take 10 years to do 5-year plan, something wrong? And I thought, oh boy, he's kind of right. We're not making the kind of progress that should be made. And then shortly after he retired, and when that happened, I moved into the forestry manager position in the region. And 8 years after starting the process, there was still no 5-year plan. And this became an issue provincially. So I was asked by the operations division management team to initiate a review of the process and look at what was going on and try and break it apart and see what was wrong and what needed to be done, what needed to be fixed. So I enlisted the support of a colleague, Daryl Larico. We traveled the province, we interviewed staff, we looked at models, we conferred with US modeling, and concluded that there was a lot of room for improvement. And we produced a report entitled The Review of the Timber Supply Analysis Process. It led to new change in legislation. Section 8 of the Forest Act flowed out of that. The creation of obligations for 5-year AAC reviews and all of the defined criteria in Section 8 that should go into an AAC review. And following that, I was appointed as regional manager in the Prince Rupert region, headquarters in Smithers. And so the new timber supply branch was formed, new models were built in-house, BC-based models, still in use today, still standing a test of time. The process had been started and was well underway in 1994, and then my predecessor, John Cuthbert, my chief forester that I admired for a large amount of my career, retired. And so I put up the funny little question, what did me and John have in common? Well, it wasn't really our backgrounds, although they were remarkably similar. We were born in the same hospital in Summerland, BC, a decade apart from one another. Just a funny little coincidence that means nothing, or does it? Anyways, in 1994, I was appointed as chief forester, and the role is known to be independent of government, but also here at the pleasure of government. So in early days, the TSR generated a lot of concerns and critics, and I just give one example. The Kinkham TSA had a quite high AAC. It's on the North Island, the mainland, 1.7 million cubic meters. We looked at it. I traveled up there. I looked at the distribution of growing stock. I looked at the higher elevation growing stock. I looked at the hypermaritime sites that were being logged. And it was really clear the unit was being over harvested. It just wasn't sustainable economically at that level. And reducing AACs is not a decision that is taken lightly by any chief forester, and certainly not by me, for the impacts that it has for communities and investments and workers. But I reduced it by 23%, and I immediately attracted some criticism from my friend Dean Clark Binkley at UBC, who was speaking at some industry conferences, PricewaterhouseCoopers annual conference, and promoting that fall downs in AAC weren't inevitable and future timber supplies were being dramatically underestimated, and perhaps the process currently leading to reductions in AACs needed to be re-examined. And well, that's a pretty big challenge after making the kind of decision I just made. So I invited him to come up to the Kinkham, and we flew the TSA quite exhaustively, and he was actually really surprised to see some of the ground that was being operated uh, that would be very, very difficult ground to manage for forest productivity into the future. And after much debate and going over the data, he did agree that AAC declines are inevitable in some areas, uh, even though future yields might be far higher than was currently or presently being forecast. To me, that was very important to work directly with critics, to be subjected to challenge, to look at it and objectively be proven wrong or right one way or the other. Just a small story of things that happened. So by the end of 1996, we finished TSR 1, and that resulted in AAC reductions in 32 units, increases in 19, and maintained in 20. So after that was done, we compiled and rolled it all up provincially. We rolled it up by region to see what it looks like, and I made a presentation to the Northern Forest Products Association in 1997 in a presentation I entitled "The Truth is Out There," and I showed the results, and I declared that timber supplies are finite and declining in BC. And bear in mind, this is not a welcome message at an industry conference, but we were showing a decline to 59 million cubic meters, but 70 years out through the fall down. We've all seen the harvest forecasts and what they look like. So I finished that presentation and I got in my rental car and I headed off to the airport in Prince George. And I turned on the radio, and CKPG was broadcasting some of the results from the conference, and they had an interview with Premier Mike Harcourt at the time. And so the interviewer posed a question, and I'm listening to this on the radio. So, Premier Harcourt, what do you think about timber supplies in British Columbia? And he said they've never been more robust and they've never been stronger, and they're rising every day. Oh, I thought to myself, this might not be good. So I flew to Victoria and got in my car and was heading down to the office, and Marg Nichols, my administrative assistant, called and said, "Are you still heading into town?" And I said, "Yes." She said, "Andrew Petter would like to see you in his office." And I said to myself, I bet I know what this is about. So I went over to the minister's office and, "Hi, Andrew," or Minister. I never called him Andrew. "Hi, Minister." "Yes." "Hi, Larry. What happened in Prince George?" And so this is a moment of a little bit of discomfort, but what can you do but tell the truth? I said, "Well, I was invited to a conference to give a presentation about the state of timber supplies. I focused in on the Prince George region during that presentation. And I did questions and answers, and I was interviewed by the radio station after the conference. And then I headed to the airport and I heard the premier on the radio with a quite different view than I had just expressed at the conference. And I said, Minister, I don't know how that happened. I was not contacted by any speechwriters, any researchers, anybody in the premier's office that would be putting speaking points or perspectives together for the premier. So I don't know who came up with that. I can assure you it was not anybody in the Forest Service. Had I been contacted, I would have given a copy of my speech. I would have gladly met with the premier to hear his thoughts and concerns. And all I can say is I will not in any way embarrass the premier on this point. If the media comes back, all I can say is I don't know exactly what the premier said because I don't know the whole context of what his interview was, and I'm just going to leave it at that. I put my comments on the record, and they stand on their own merits, but I'm not going to take difference with the premier. That's not my place. And I always used to say to staff and others that the position does have a high degree of independence, and it's true, it does. You're there at the pleasure of government. That means by order and counsel. But I always tried to practice independence without arrogance and be thoughtful and sensitive to the positions of the political administration. Anyways, after 10 years, I completed 100 AAC determinations. Very exhausting, but I sure had a unique perspective on the province. And currently now, well, I had projected the AAC would be 58 million 70 years out. It is currently 57 million, and it came down a lot faster than initially anticipated. And there were a lot of contributing factors. And while it's at 57, I will say the implications of the old growth report and the uncertainty around managing old growth in the province are all just around the corner as well. So a little bit of mountain pine beetle stuff, maybe of bigger interest to people on the coast who didn't really live it and see it the way that I did. But it was massive and devastating. And this was the map that basically showed where there was pine from the southeast of the Kootenays to the northwest part of the province. Where there was pine, there was high levels of mortality. And we did a lot of examination. There's been a lot of different suggestions about how it started and the role of Tweedsmuir Park and so on. But it's really important to note that around the time that the epidemic developed, there were 3 times more area of mature pine than there was in 1910. And the reason for that largely had to do with the success of fire suppression in the province. And therefore, I'm going to call it an artificial aging of forests, which otherwise would have had very high levels of disturbance from natural repeating fire cycles. And then that's overlaid with changed weather patterns. We had less hostile winters. That endemic population was always kept in check with hostile weather. We weren't getting the 40 belows anymore, and that held true all the way across the province. So we started modeling. The growth in those early years was absolutely exponential. 51% of birch pine in the interior, which was the largest cut species in the interior, was the dominant mainstay of the industry, was dead by 2010. And the current estimate now is that just under 800 million cubic meters were lost. So the AAC implications were that I faced the dilemma of raising the AAC during a period of declining inventories. And it was contentious, obviously. We did uplifts to just over 80 million cubic meters, with the reasoning being that from an economic perspective, we should try and recover as much as possible, even though there's large-scale future economic disruption on the horizon. But this would at least allow the areas to get replanted and get forest productivity reestablished on these vast, vast areas of dead forest. So this became a big issue in government. I went with Premier Campbell to Quesnel in 2003. I made presentations to the Deputies Council. We tried to mobilize other areas of government around jobs and community impacts and job transition, because the impact on the industry was foreseeable and getting out in front of it was more important than not. And after I retired, there was an all-party special committee on timber supply appointed. So it was an NDP Liberal initiative trying to figure out how to manage and transition interior communities, economies facing mill closures, what were the responsibilities of government. So former Chief Forester Jim Snetzinger and myself were appointed as special advisors to the committee. In our retirement, we traveled with the MLAs. We went to 15 interior communities, 3 days of hearings in Vancouver, sifted through 650 submissions, produced a final report, and an action plan was developed, and all the recommendations were accepted. And it was the only all-party committee to that point in the history of the legislature that actually came in unanimously supported by all the members. But the impacts were devastating. So 2 years ago, Canfor's Prince George Pulp and Paper Mill went down. Last year, West Fraser shut down Fraser Lake sawmills. Jim Gervan has been the voice of forecasting the impacts on the sector. He forecast the closure of 16 lumber, veneer, and plywood mills by 2019, and that was exactly the number. That's precisely what happened. And there's more closures to come, and now somewhat compounded by the impacts of some of the massive wildfires that have occurred in the last decade. So this is what it means to small towns. So the Lakes TSA, this is the Burns Lake area. I was struck by how very strong the timber supply was. It had almost a flatline timber supply. It had good distribution of growing stock. And then mountain pine beetle started to hit. There were AAC uplifts to try and get the economic salvage. And then the cut dropped to less than 1,000,000 meters. So the loss of 500,000 meters in a small town like Burns Lake was a bitter pill to swallow. But an American company, Hampton Lumber, came and took partnership with the Burns Lake Native Development Corporation and figured out how to scale operations to the known and projected timber supply in the area. Anyways, that's just an area that I spent a lot of time in. I'm starting to run a bit late, so I'm going to just try and pick it up. Some of my other challenges, market campaigns during my tenure, new forest legislation. I finished the legislation for the Forest Practices Code as the executive sponsor, and I lived through its implementation and training, and I lived through the critique and analysis about cost and impact on timber supply, and then I led the development of the policy team to develop the Forest and Range Practices Act to move from something too prescriptive to something that I felt at the time perhaps was too flexible. So there have been much said and many changes since my time with FHRPA, but it continues to be the base for planning in BC. Land use plans were underway through my tenure with the Land Use Coordination Office. I worked closely with all of the land use planning tables. protected areas strategy, the doubling and tripling of protected areas was underway, special emphasis zones for forest certification, and then market campaigns. And the market campaigns were significant and influential. The critics of BC forestry learned how to go into the corporate boardrooms and make them nervous about the sustainability of practices in BC, even though we were doing all those different things. So I was in a Canadian Embassy boardroom in Frankfurt with Derek Thompson from the Land Use Coordination Office and Rick Slacko from Interfor, Bill Dumont from Western Forest Products. And we were making presentations to a group of German industrialists and consumers of BC forest products, solid wood and pulp and paper. And I'm standing over an overhead projector with some acetate slides, and it's blowing hot, and I'm sweating like crazy. And it's pretty clear that the audience we're talking to is hostile, but we're doing our best to say, look, we're aware of what these issues are. We have all this list of changes going on, protected areas, land use planning, zoning. We're looking at allowable cuts. We've got new forest practices. And I was getting these responses like, what makes you people think you have the right to cut those trees? They are the cathedrals of my heart. And I'm like, oh, okay. There's definitely some strong opposition in this room. And while I was still cheerfully trying to optimistically paint a story saying BC is listening and trying to deal with it, all of a sudden I heard this kind of drumming. Outside, we were up on a fourth floor. The windows were closed because there was construction outside and there was no air conditioning. And all of a sudden, an inflatable 40-foot grizzly bear floated past the window of the boardroom. So we looked out the window, and Chief Ed Moody from the New Hawk Nation was there with Greenpeace and the giant cedar Stumpy that they toured around Europe, and the inflatable grizzly bear. And Greenpeace's narrative was BC still not getting it. So those were challenging moments for the province. They were certainly challenging moments for me. Anyways, so here's a bit of a summary of some things I've learned. With all the progress that we've made, and we should be proud of it, much remains to be done, and I truly feel that in my heart. Fred Bunnell said at a PricewaterhouseCoopers conference that I spoke at that his famous quote, "Forestry isn't rocket science, it's way more complicated than that." He was right. I often focus on the fact that BC's forest sector is built on access to public forests. And in a public forest, public will prevails. So I've always said it's important to know the differences between rights and privileges. We still have to respect and work within the classic definitions of the tensions between social, economic, and environmental considerations before we can say we've understood or arrived at sustainability. The practice of forestry is more fun than practicing the politics of forestry. I kind of had a decade of that. And I will say that in my view, the decisions that have been made were reasonably achievable, but the tough ones remain. So I'm still an advocate for tough decisions need to be made on the basis of good available data, comprehensive analysis, having strategies for risk and uncertainty, and clear assessment of the implications of the decision options. And then both a political administration and a professional body that is prepared to make necessary decisions in a timely manner. So the current chief forester, Shane Berg, is a cartoonist. And he made these cartoons of me various points in my career. So what do I see in my crystal ball? Well, in 2012, I made a presentation at UNBC after I was retired to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the BC Forest Service. It was a very well-attended presentation, and Jim Snetzer and I did it jointly. And it was fun. It was exciting to kind of be back in the saddle a bit shortly after retirement. And then we got to the Q's and A's, and Bill Dumont was in the audience at the time because the Forest Practices Board was meeting in Prince George. And he said, "So Larry, is there any business that you feel was left undone during your tenure as chief forester?" And I said, "Yeah, there is, Bill. I think we failed to develop a sustainable old growth strategy in the province. And I think that there's going to be implications for that in years to come. And we took several runs at trying to do it, including during my tenure, but they were met with a fairly high degree of resistance, and it was very difficult to move them forward. So now we have the old growth report with some very, very profound implications and massive amounts of complexity in implementing the recommendations. DRIPA still remains very challenging. There's been some very progressive move with nations on revenue sharing, tenures, shared decision making, but I believe that that process and those terms have only but started. They're going to go a lot further than they have, in my humble estimation. Climate change, forest level impacts, carbon sequestration, still a huge, not fully cracked nut. Biodiversity challenges, wildfire management, right sizing the sector in the context of challenge and change. It's been downsized by virtue of failing timber supplies, but there's many other really large forces at work that will come to bear on the scale of the industry in the future. And right now, it is well known and understood and documented that there's a capital strike in BC. There's no investment for all of the reasons of future uncertainty. And I believe that that is probably the biggest challenge that BC faces right now, making sure that the strategies that are being taken on are taken on with the right analysis to understand what it means to the forest sector and to get the scale of the industry proper and get capital flowing again. It's still a vital industry to the future of the province. So old growth, I'm just going to skip through this very quickly. In 2003, I made a presentation to the truck loggers about old growth on the coast. And I basically said, look, if we stop logging old growth right now, we're dropping from 19 million cubic meters to 8.3 million. The impact on coastal communities, on workers, on investments of that kind of scenario are profound. And I don't profess to know where this issue is going, and I didn't at the time, but I looked at what had previously been forecast as a base case. I looked at that blue line of what if we phase old growth out over 20 years. You still a precipitous drop to 11 million meters. Or what if we try and manage it out more carefully, but still have higher levels of conservation? And that still showed a large drop and a big age. And it relates back to this slide. The age class distribution is a challenge for the coast. So I'm going to say this is the end. This was a Shane Berg contribution to one of my presentations. There was no right answer. I never found it during the whole tenure of my career, in spite of working hard to try and thoroughly understand. So I retired from the chief's position in 2005. I retired from deputy minister in 2010. So is there life after deputy? So I'm just going to go off topic for just a couple of minutes and say, yes, there is. 2015, we put on backpacks and took on the Juan de Fuca Trail. In September, me and my wife and two friends hiked 350 kilometers from Mexico to Palm Springs through the Santa Rosa mountain range on the Pacific Crest Trail. It took us 18 days. This was a formation that we found out in the middle of the desert called Eagle Rock. It's a natural formation, pretty high spiritual value to the Cahuilla Indian band in the area. In 2017, I went over the top of Mount Baden-Powell at 10,000 feet in San Gabriel Mountain Range, again on the PCT. That's the Little Tread Trail as part of the Pacific Crest Trail, 2,650 miles from Mexico to Manning Park. We've done about 1,000 miles of it. Sorry, I switched to miles because I spend a lot of time in the United States in the winter, so I go imperial when I'm there and metric when I'm home. So we've continued to hike the PCT. This is an interesting slide. The desert mountains are fascinating. They're barren with low shrub, plant, and grass communities and very low productivity, up to about 5,000 feet. And then when you get in the range of 5,000 to 10,000 feet, you get this just startling forest productivity. And the ecological basis for that is you've moved out of a very hostile desert climate into a less hostile but very warm high mountain climate. Just absolutely fascinating. So 2012 to 2025, I do day hikes, and there's just these beautiful pieces of terrain all over the Coachella Valley, Palm Springs area where I've been wintering. But it doesn't always go well. In 2022, I bailed off the side of the West Coast Trail with a 45-pound pack on and bounced down a very steep bank, hitting rocks and trees for about 50 feet. That wasn't fun, and it ended up sort of looking like that. But that is the end.